Well, welcome. I'm so glad you joined us this morning. Some of you know this, some of you may not, but about 2 years ago, myself and a man in our church, Kyle McNay, he was playing the violin this morning. He and I, here he is right here. He and I, 2 years ago, went to Ukraine to teach at a Bible college there. I was able to teach through the prophets. He taught through church history, which if you've come to his Exodus Institute courses, you know how beneficial that is. So we were there for about 10 days and taught through, in a week, like 6 hours a day of teaching to get through all the prophets and pretty much all of church history, which was great. And this Bible college in Ukraine has these young believers, men and women, that want to go into the ministry. So we had the opportunity to be a part of that development, which was fantastic. And our prayer is to be able to go back again next year. But while we were there, it was a fascinating thing to be in a city. We're in Korostin, Ukraine, and this city is over 1,000 years old. And it was really something to walk on streets that are older than our country, right? And to see these monuments of kings and queens that represent people from the 12th century. It was really an incredible thing. It was a humbling experience in a lot of ways, just to see the rich history that they have in Ukraine. We had some of the students give us tours, and they kind of walked us through the city and showed us some of the different monuments, these massive statues of great knights and so on. But some of them, the stories behind it were very tragic. I mean, they were very evil men or women that oppressed the people of Ukraine, that slaughtered people, that made life very difficult in their day. And there were monuments of good kings and good queens that helped flourish the area and so on. So as we're walking through, it's really a cool thing to experience, these monuments representing hundreds of years of history, of both good and bad. And then more immediately, just as we're walking around, we see this city of Korostin with all of its history in complete shambles. The city has been devastated by the Soviet Union for 70 so on years. And it fell about 30 years ago. And even still, you see all the effects of what the Soviet Union did to Ukraine. I mean, there are buildings that are just piles of cinder blocks and concrete. And it's the city itself is in really rough shape because of what it's gone through. A great oppression in that city and in that area for many years. On the way home, we stopped in Germany and were able to visit Dachau, the concentration camp. And that is an incredibly humbling experience. And we walked around this massive facility that housed, hundreds of thousands of Jewish people during World War II. And to walk through the museum and to see the monuments and to see what those people went through, it's a very somber experience to just be in the presence of such evil that took place over a course of years in that location. And so the evil of the Nazi Germany and what they did during the Holocaust was just realized in a different way. And then when we come home and you turn on the news and, man, the evil doesn't stop, right? It's not like it was 1,000 years ago or 60 years ago. This is now the evil is among us. I mean, we see the Islamic State persecuting Christians brutally throughout the world. We see oppression all over the place. We see evil constantly. We live in a fallen, broken world. And when we think about evil, whether it's hundreds or thousands of years ago or currently, it all follows the same stream and it all stems from the same place. Right? That stem, that location, that fountainhead, if you would, of evil was the fall in the garden. We see this when Satan came in and he tempted Adam and Eve and they ate of the fruit and they fell. The curse of sin now goes and spreads, as Paul says in Romans 5, it spreads to all mankind. For all those who are in Adam die because of the curse of sin. And as God, he enters into the garden, you remember the story, and he speaks to Adam and to Eve and he speaks to the serpent. And in Genesis 3:15, we have God's words to the serpent. And it says this, he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So here we see God telling the serpent, because of this sin, you are going to be at war with the woman and with the offspring of the woman. You and your offspring are going to be at war with the woman and her offspring. And it says that he'll put enmity between them. That word is not one that we often use. Enmity means hostility, tension, war, wrath, anger. Things are not good when the serpent and the woman come into contact, or when the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent come into contact. There is going to be constant struggle, constant war. And this is what we see happening all throughout the Bible, right? Is that the offspring of the woman is represented by those who are covenant members of God, right? Who follow God. They are his people. That is the offspring of the woman. The offspring of the serpent are those who war against the people of God, right? So that's like physically what it is. Then you got the idea of just sin and brokenness is the result of sin. And then we fight against sin as the offspring of the woman, trying to push justice and faithfulness and God's glory into this broken world. We want to push back the darkness with the light of the gospel. But there's always a war, right? When these two things come together, there's always tension. There's always war. And as we read through the scripture, we see this war constantly taking place. Immediately with Cain and Abel, right? You have Cain as this serpent figure, and then Abel as the figure of the woman's offspring, holy and righteous in his offering, and they go to war. We see this with Noah and the rest of the world. Noah represents the faithful ones, those who follow God, the offspring of the woman, and he's waging war with the world at this time, which is the offspring of the serpent. So we have these serpent figures coming up all throughout the scripture. We see this with Moses and the serpent figure of Pharaoh. We see this with Joshua and the serpent figures of the Canaanites. We saw this last week with Ehud and the serpent figure of Eglon. We see God's people warring back and forth with these serpent figures all throughout the Bible. We see God's people crushing the heads of these serpent figures, and we see these offspring of the serpent bruising the heel of God's people. It's not a death blow, but it is a wound, a serious wound at that. In fact, this is what we see going on in the cycle of the Judges, right? Is the cycle of the Judges, you have God's people doing evil in the sight of the Lord. They essentially become like the serpent. The woman's offspring begins to act like the offspring of the serpent. So God raises up an enemy to bruise the heel of God's people, to bring them into captivity. And then they cry out for deliverance, and God raises up a judge to crush the head of the enemy, to crush the head of the serpent figure, and then to move into redemption. This is a story that happens over and over in Judges. It happens over and over in the scriptures as well, finding its ultimate fulfillment in Christ, who is the ultimate snake crusher. So we see this same cycle happen even this morning in the Judges, as the serpent figures, which is Sisera and the Canaanites, bruise the heel of the offspring of the woman, which is Israelites. So look with me at Judges chapter 4, starting in verse 1. And as we work through this, we will see that the judges are these types and shadows of the ultimate snake crusher, which is Jesus. And we see the villains as types and shadows of the snake himself, which is Satan. So this begins with us, this story begins in Judges chapter 4, verse 1. And it says, "And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord," after Ehud died. Right? So the people of God have now done evil. They have become like the offspring of the serpent in the sight of the Lord. And they did this after Ehud died. We looked at Ehud last week. He killed Eglon, the king, redeemed the people, crushed the head, if you would, and then he ruled for 80 years and there was peace. But once he died, the leadership went away and the people began to go toward Canaan, right? Become like the Canaanites, canonized, if you would. So we see this happening after Ehud died. And then we see in verse 2, it says this, "And the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. Now, as we read through this, the first service will know, and I practiced a lot of these names even yesterday. But as we read through it, I just need a lot of grace from you. As I say the wrong words or say the same word multiple ways, but God is good, and he will sustain us as we go. I felt at the end of the sermon I should have said that as a preface to the last sermon as we wrestled through it. All right, so we have the Lord sold them. This is the wound to the heel to Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor, and the commander of his army was Sisera, and he lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. So Jabin is not a proper name. This is a dynastic title. It's like Pharaoh, right? There's lots of Jabins in the same way there's lots of Pharaohs, and so on. However, we see Jabin meet his demise at the end of the story, 24. No spoiler alert. We knew this was going to happen. But he has a very small role to play in this. He's not the main serpent figure in this story. It's not Jabin, but rather it's Jabin's commander, or the commander of Jabin's army, Sisera. Sisera is the main serpent figure in the story. So look with me, if you would, at verse 3, as we see Israel now crying out, having been brought under the oppression of Sisera and Jabin. It says this in verse 3, then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help. Right? They realized, man, this heel wound is killing us. We are in a bad place. Lord, we need help. So they finally cry out, repent to God. And one of the reasons they did that, it says, is for he had 900 chariots of iron. And he oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years. So he oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years. Now we saw with Ehud and the Moabites, it wasn't so much slave labor and physical torment with them, but it was, they just brought them into this Sodom and Gomorrah culture and lifestyle, and Israel became captive to that sin. Jabin and Sisera and the Canaanites are more like Pharaoh in Egypt. Right? They want to make the life of the Israelites as miserable as possible. They end up taking away all of their weapons. They tax the roads. They put guards up in the road so the Israelites cannot walk on the main roads, lest they may be killed or brought into a greater form of punishment and slavery. They were incredibly cruel. They even killed all the farmers and the people out in the land, the open land, the villagers. They destroyed them. Israel at this point is in a very bad place under horrible oppression to the Canaanites. And it is in this helpless state that Israel cries out to God, saying, God, we need something. We will die if you don't rescue us. Excuse me. And we see God answer their cry for help in a different sort of way in this story. You know, in the past, when God's people would cry out for help, God raised up a Yasha, a judge that was a warrior, right? We have Othniel, who was the giant slayer. We have Ehud, who was the left-handed assassin. We even have Shamgar, which we haven't talked about yet. Shamgar, and we'll look at him, he's in one verse. He's a minor judge. But Shamgar, likewise, is a warrior. Look at Judges 3:31. It says, after him, that's Ehud, was Shamgar, the son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad. And he also saved Israel. Right? So you have this other judge that God raised up to save Israel, and he did so by going to war with a piece of farming equipment. In fact, there's a really cool parallel, I think, with Shamgar and Christ. I think Shamgar, like all the judges, points to Christ, even in this one verse. How you have this judge that God has raised up, and he conquers the enemy with an instrument that is actually used for discipline. And in doing so, he saves Israel, he saves God's people. This is exactly what Christ did. God raised Christ up as the ultimate judge, and he defeats his enemy with an instrument that is used for torture and discipline and a cross. And in doing so, he saves God's people. So even in this one verse of Shamgar, we see the gospel coming out of it, and we should not ignore that. So we have Shamgar, another warrior. But this time, in chapter 4, he raises up a different sort of judge. He doesn't raise up a warrior like Othniel or Ehud or Shamgar, but this time he raises up a woman named Deborah. A woman named Deborah. Look with me at verse 4. It says, now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. Now, Deborah is a woman in the Bible that is exemplary. She is one that is put forward as an example for all women in all time. The book of Judges and the story of Deborah is broken up into two parts, where you have the story in chapter 4 of what Deborah's role is as a judge, and then you have a song in chapter 5, which retells the story in a poetic way. So as we look at Deborah this morning, we're not going to be able to get through all of the song, but we're going to pull some aspects of the song into the narrative to help us understand who she was. But as we go through that, we see that Deborah is indeed a woman that we should, you ladies, should aspire to be like. She was a wife. She was a mother. She was godly. She was wise. She was a leader. She empowered those around her, and she raised up a godly generation after her. Now, Deborah is somewhat of a controversial figure in the Bible. I don't know if you've ever read anything on Deborah or heard people talk about Deborah, but in the world of gender roles within the Bible and within society, Deborah is a polarizing figure, right? You have on one side more of the feminist women and men are exactly equal. There's no distinction in any way. And I've actually read some of the literature, and one of the authors would say, if we can just find one example of a woman in the Bible that bursts the bonds apart of this, oppressive patriarchy that we see, then we can believe that women and men, God has called women and men to the exact same roles, right? That women can do anything that men can do biblically. We just need one example, and Deborah is their example. Right? Deborah is the hero of that kind of feminist, or hyper-feminist, I should say, ideology that wants to flatten out any sort of gender role distinction in the Bible, okay? And then on the other side, you have the more conservative complementarians that want to see men and women's roles very different and distinct in the scriptures, that God has called men to certain roles and he has called women to certain roles. And then they look at Deborah and say, oh gosh, it's kind of a head scratcher because she doesn't fit our mold. She tends to go above and beyond what we think a woman should be in civilization or even in the church. Right? So you have these two polarizing positions, and both of them want to do different things with Deborah. One of them wants to exalt her. The other wants to suppress her. So let's explain her away. I've heard people say that Deborah was raised up as a judge, and that was to Israel's shame, right? Because Israel is disobeying, so they raise up a woman, and it's to their shame. But the problem is we don't see that anywhere in the Bible. Like it doesn't say that was to their shame that God raised up Deborah. So who is this woman? How should we view Deborah? And what we don't want to do is fall trap to any polarizing opinion, right? We don't want to be with the more conservative complementarian views of Deborah and try to explain her story away as if it's not real or it's not for us or it's not an example, right? We don't want to do that. We also don't want to side with the feminist side that see her as like the Xena warrior princess that can go out and conquer bad guys with a sword. We don't want to do that either. So what we want to do is be able to go to the text and say, okay, what does the Bible say about Deborah? And then how should we understand the gender role debate within the church based off of Deborah's life and, of course, the rest of Scripture? So how should we view Deborah? Well, the reality is when we look at her story in the Scriptures, it makes both sides very uncomfortable, right? It makes both sides very uncomfortable, and that's okay. We don't want to fall trap again to this polarizing view of Deborah. All right, so who is she? What is she about? Verse 4 tells us that Deborah is a prophetess, a wife, and a judge. She is a prophetess, a wife, and a judge. She is a leader in Israel. So what do we do with this? Should it be surprising to us when we see a woman described as a prophetess in the Bible? Should that cause us to say, wait a second, I've read the prophets, and none of the books of the Bible have a woman's name as a prophet? Should this concern us? The answer is absolutely not. The Bible is very clear. There are actually multiple prophetesses in the Bible, and Deborah being one of them. But the reason that it should not concern us that she's a prophetess is because God has made men and women completely different, right? Completely different. No matter what modern day society tries to say about gender distinction, God has made men completely different than women, and women completely different than men. From top to bottom, inside out, everything is different. So in the Bible, when we see a prophet and a prophetess, we should see these are two totally different things, right? The role of a prophet is not the role of the prophet is here, and it can either be filled by a man or a woman. Let me give you an example. For a parent, right? If you're a parent, the role of parent cannot be filled by a man or by a woman. That's not how it works. To be a parent has two roles, a father and a mother, right? We can't say to be a parent is to be either a man or a woman. No, there's two very different roles with two very different distinctions, and God has called each of those roles to very different but complementary missions. You can think about it even with a spouse, right? If you don't have the role spouse and say, okay, either a man or a woman, or two men or two women can fill this role. Say, no, spouse is not a role that can be filled by a man or a woman. There's two different aspects. There's the husband and there's a wife, right? You have a husband spouse and a wife spouse. They're not the same. So it is with prophet. It's not the role of a prophet and who gets to fill it, a man or a woman. No, it's not that. You have man prophets and you have lady prophets. You have prophets and prophetesses, right? Two very different roles that complement each other very well. We see this with deacons. You have the role of deacon is not filled by man or woman, but we see men as deacons, and you see women as deaconesses. And the Bible's full of deaconesses in the Bible, right? But they serve, they exercise their calling differently. They don't try to do the same thing. They're not competing with one another for this role of deacon. They complement each other well. We can see this with kings and queens as well, right? It's not that God doesn't call women to be kings. He calls them to be queens, right? And there's great power and authority and responsibility with that. If a king dies, the woman doesn't say, ooh, I get to be king now. No, she's still queen, right? So it is with judge and judges as well. You have a judge, you have men judges, and you have women judges. You have judge and judgesses. All right? Does that make sense? Do we understand what's going on here? So when we read verse 4, and it says that she was a prophetess, she was a wife, and she was judging at that time, we don't think that she was doing the same thing as Jeremiah or Isaiah was doing, because they're prophets. She's doing what Anna was doing in the New Testament, right? She was doing what Miriam was doing or Helda was doing. She's a prophetess, something different but complementing. All right, so that helps us understand how we are to view her and understand her role within the church and how we understand women's roles within the church. In fact, really the only role that we see that doesn't have the male and then the female counterpart is priest. There are no priestesses in the Bible. The role of priest, the one who presides over the liturgical service and speaks for God or speaks on behalf of God to the people, is only designated for men. And in that role we see as pastor and elder in the New Testament. So we should not be surprised to see that Deborah is a female judge, a judges. And when we see this and we accept this, we then get to pay very close attention as to how she images God in her role that God has given her as a judges. She images God in ways that the male judges cannot. And the most obvious way that she does that is God rose her up as a mother in Israel. God raises her up as a mother in Israel. Remember what I said, how the story of Deborah has the song in chapter 5? Well, in chapter 5, verse 6 and 7, it says this. In the days of Shamgar, the son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were abandoned. That's the main paths, right? The Canaanites shut down the highways. They were persecuting the people so that they couldn't travel on the highways. And travelers kept to the byways. These are paths through the mountains and so on. The villagers ceased. These are the farmers, those who work out in the open land. They were destroyed. And then it says that they ceased to be until I arose. I, Deborah, arose as a mother in Israel. Everything was a mess, right? Everything is so bad in Israel until God raises up a mother for the people. God raises up a mother for Israel. You see, at this time, Israel is without any leadership. They don't know how to fight. They're not organized, and they don't have anybody to lead them. So what does God do with his pathetic children? He gives them a mother. And a mother is what they needed. Because what do mothers do? They raise up godly generations. That's what mothers do. Raise up godly generations. Deborah does not try to be a father. She does not try to be a priest. She does not try to be a warrior judge like Ehud or Shamgar. She is a mother in Israel. She is a mother, and Israel is her children. Deborah takes a role that highlights the maternal aspects of God's character, which we see all throughout the Bible. One of my favorite stories is Moses. He tries to take on the maternal role of God as he's leading Israel through the wilderness, and he's complaining to God. And all you husbands can understand this. He's leading through and he says, God, I've been trying so hard. I've been like a nursing mother to these people. I've been trying to bring them through. And he's like, I just can't do it. It's too hard, right? And all the dads are like, yeah, amen. I don't know how God has gifted women to do what you do as mothers. And Moses doesn't know either. He's saying, this is too hard for me. I can't do this. He's like, I want to kill these people, get rid of them. But what Moses is doing is trying to lead by taking upon himself the maternal role that is inherent within God, right? This is part of God's character, this maternal love. In fact, we see God talk about this in the prophets, where he refers to himself as a mother of his people. We see Jesus talking in this language, and he says, how I would have gathered you like a hen gathers her chicks, right? This is protection. This is guidance that Jesus speaks in very maternal language. Paul likewise speaks to the churches in maternal terms, how I have tried to work with you through the pains of childbirth and all of this and raise you up, but you're making it very difficult for me, is what Paul says. So we see the people, the servants of God, wanting to lead by reflecting the maternal aspect of God's character. So when we come to a story like Deborah, we say, here's a character that does it naturally. This is a woman now that takes upon herself that maternal leadership of a mother, that maternal leadership that images God so well. So who is Deborah? She's not a female prophet. She's a prophetess, right? She's not a female judge. She's a judgess. And she is a mother of Israel. One of the cool things about Deborah that we see that she is a prophetess, and then she is a wife. She's a wife of Labadoth, right? And wife there in Hebrew is the word ish, which means woman. And then Labadoth, her husband's name is flame or torch. So you could see her name being, she's a woman of fire, right? She's a woman of fire by title with her marriage to her husband. And her name means honeybee, right? Honeybee is what Deborah means. And a lot of people say, yeah, she has honey for her children and a stinger for her enemies. And this is what we see coming out, that this woman is fierce. She is a fierce, strong woman. So the text goes on to explain a little bit more about Deborah. Look at verse 5. It says this, she, of Deborah, used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. Now, this isn't the sort of judgment like, I've done something wrong, will you punish me, sort of judgment, like shame on you. Judgment here is instruction. It is advice. It is counsel. She is the one who speaks with God as a prophetess. She hears from God. She communes with God, and she goes back and she gives God's wisdom to the people of God who are in need. This is what it is to judge as a prophetess. So they come up to her, they ask for wisdom, they ask for instruction, they ask for advice or guidance, and just godly counsel. And it could be anything from, my wife and I, we cannot live with each other. And we're feeling like we need to split. It could be something as significant as that. Or it could be something as far as, I've got a potential job offer over here. I don't know which one to take. What should I do? You go to the mother of Israel. You go to the woman who has the wisdom, the one who speaks with God. So they go, and she would judge the people of Israel. All right, so this is who she is, and now she has heard a word from the Lord. And this is how the story gets moving here. She hears a word from the Lord, and she wants to call her children to herself as the mother of Israel. And this word is, it's time to get out of here. God has given us a time and a place. It is time for us to be delivered from Sisera's snake-like, serpent-like oppression. All right, so what does she do? She calls Barak. Look with me at verses 6 through 7. She sent and summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh, Naphtali. There it is. No, I don't know if I said it right. Naphtali, that's it. From Kadesh, Naphtali. And said to him, has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you, go, gather the men of Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun, and I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon, and with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. All right, so essentially Deborah calls Barak, one of her sons in Israel that she has been pouring into, raising up as a godly young man, and says, son, it's time. The Lord has called you to gather 10,000 men. Now, these men are not warriors. These guys are disarmed peasants at this time who have been oppressed for 20 years, tortured. These are not trained warriors. So God has called you to gather the 10,000 of them and go to war against Sisera to be delivered. And I will give Sisera into your hands. All right, this is good news. Now notice that Deborah does not say that the Lord is going to give Sisera into my hands. Deborah is a judgess, a prophetess. She's a woman. She is not the warrior. In fact, the law is very clear. Women are not to be the ones out there waging war with spear and sword, but rather they are to indeed lead in a different sort of way. So she doesn't say, the Lord is going to hand Sisera into my hands. She goes, it's going to be yours, Barak. It's time for you to do this. So really, essentially what's happening is you have this mother calling her son to herself and saying, all right, son, it's time to be a man. It's time to man up and do what God has called you to do. And moms, you want to know one of the most inspiring things you can do for your sons is tell them to be men. There's nothing more inspiring and humbling for a young man to hear their mom say, it's time for you to be a man. Follow God. Do as he has called you to do. And this is what she does with Barak. Time to go to war and deliver the people. So how does Barak respond? Well, unfortunately, not well. Verse 8 says that Barak said to her, if you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. All right, so Barak is saying, you really expect me to go battle Sisera, this serpent figure, with all of his 900 chariots of iron, with these slouches? Forget about it. But if you go with me, I know God is with you, Deborah, mother of Israel. I know God is with you. If you'll come, then I'll go. Barak has a weak faith here. It's faith. It's not that he's absent of faith. It's not cowardice. He does go to war, and he does quite well. But his faith here is weak. It's kind of one of those things, hey, I believe, but help me in my unbelief. So how does Deborah respond to Barak's weak faith? She said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory. For the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. So here, Barak receives just a minor discipline, right? It's saying, I'm going to go with you. You're still going to fight. You're still going to do great. The Lord is going to go before you. But the road on which you're walking will not lead to your glory. There's no glory in asking your mom to go to battle with you, right? You need to trust the Lord. I'll go with you. I will help you. I'll be there. But this is not a glorious road for you. For the Lord will hand Sisera into the hand of a woman. So who is this woman that she speaks of? Well, her name is Jael, and we'll get to her momentarily. So we see Barak get ready for war. Deborah's coming with, let's do this. Verse 10, it says, and Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 men went up at his heels, and Deborah went with them. So now they're getting ready for war. Now, Heber, the Kenite, Heber is a guy, we got to put like a pin in that and come right back to him, okay, because he matters in a moment. But Heber, the Kenite, had separated from the Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tent as far away as the oak of Zinnamon, which is near Kadesh. All right, so we'll get back to this guy. All right, verse 12. When Sisera was told that Barak, the son of Abinio, that guy, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera called all of his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the men who were with him, from Harosheth Hagoim to the river Kishon. All right, so what's happened here is you have, all right, Barak, I'm going to do this. So he gets his 10,000, and he goes and he's ready for war. Sisera hears that Barak is on the move with 10,000. He goes, this is not happening. I'm getting my 900 chariots of iron and all my warriors, and we're going to go and just slaughter them, right? So that's the scene as it is laid out in these verses. And then we see in verse 14, the action picks up. And Deborah said to Barak, "Up, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. Does not the Lord go before you?" What a powerful thing to say. Does not the Lord go out before you? Does not the Lord, Yahweh himself, is going out before you? So Barak, with confidence now, went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. So we see Deborah reminding Barak of who's really going to win this war for you. Who's really going to fight for you? And this time, Barak doesn't have a weak faith. He says, okay, we're going to do this. And he goes with his 10,000 men with the encouragement and the empowerment of the mother of Israel, saying, be a man and go. Follow the Lord. He goes before you. Verse 15 says this, "And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army before Barak by the edge of the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot." All right, so we have the Lord going before him. Israel and the 10,000 are going down Mount Tabor, which is a strange thing to do because it's a better place to be, military, as you're fighting, to be up high. But they're going down into the valley to fight. And Yahweh himself is going before him. So we can kind of get this picture of 10,000 men charging down this mountain, and the angel of the Lord, Yahweh himself, is going before them. And chapter 5 actually describes the atmosphere of this. There's a great rainstorm going on. The river was rising and shifting, and there's great earthquakes that were happening. This is what happens when Yahweh goes before you, right? It's like he has control of the thunder. He has control of the weather, which is kind of a cool little tidbit because Baal, the Canaanites' god, is the god of the storm, god of thunder, and so on. So you have Yahweh, in a sense, defeating Baal with his own weapon. He takes control of the weather and destroys the Canaanites. So, in this word routed here, it means to like confuse. So you have these chariots, Sisera's chariots and his army, and they've been routed by God. They've been confused. I don't know if maybe the Lord just got into the mind of the horses and had them do things that they shouldn't have done. Maybe it was the water that was rising that caused them to be confused, or the soldiers themselves were just confused. But either way, the Lord confused the army to the point where they just walked into their own death. They walked into the edge of the sword of Israel. All right, so we have Sisera now, who is watching all of this happen. Like, what are my men doing? They're better than this. And maybe the mud is getting bad, so the chariots are having a hard time moving. And Sisera just sees this slaughter taking place. And he's like, I'm out of here. So he gets down off of his chariot and he runs away, right? He flees. We'll come back to him in a moment. Barak, I don't know if he saw Sisera leave or not, but Barak continues to pursue these chariots, and he does so, and he conquers them, which we see in verse 16. He conquers them to the point where the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword, and not a man was left, right? It was a complete destruction of Sisera's army, except for Sisera, as he got off his chariot and ran away. So where did he go? Where did Sisera run off to? We see this in verse 17. But Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber, the Kenite. This is the guy that we put the pin in before, right? Heber, the Kenite, was related to Moses' father-in-law. He was a part of the covenant people of God for years. His family, his descendants, and he himself, him and Jael, used to be a part of God's people. And then he turned his back, probably due to the oppression of the Canaanites, and said, I'd rather live peaceably with the Canaanites than to suffer with the Lord. So I'm going to pitch my tent over here. We're going to make a peace treaty with Jabin the king, and we're just not going to worry about it anymore. So this is who this guy is. But Sisera runs to his wife's tent, Jael. All right? It says, for there was peace. So he goes to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. For there was peace between Jabin the king of Hazor and the house of Heber the Kenite. So Sisera ran away and saw Jael's tent. And he's like, oh, we're good here. We have an alliance here. We're good. I can get some protection, maybe take a nap, whatever it might be that I need. So that's what happens here. So Sisera gets to the tent of Jael, and it says in verse 18 that Jael comes out and meets him. It says, and Jael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, turn aside, my lord. Turn aside to me. Do not be afraid. So he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. And he said to her, please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. So she opens a skin of milk and gives him a drink and covered him. And then he said to her, stand by the opening of the tent, and if any man comes to you and asks you, is anyone there? Say no. She's like, okay. So if the story stopped there, we'd say, okay, Jael's actually putting this guy up. She's protecting him. However, that's not what's going on. We'll see soon that this is actually part of Jael's deception. Jael's deception is what brings her glory. This is Jael deceiving Sisera so that she might be the one to crush his head, the serpent figure's head. You remember back in the garden where we saw that the first conflict is between the serpent and the woman. And who won the first conflict? It was the serpent. And how did he do that? By deceiving the woman, right? He deceived the woman. Then what we see happening after that is women in the Bible see deception as their greatest weapon against the serpent. We see this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth sort of retribution to what the serpent had done to Eve. Women throughout the Bible repeatedly deceive serpent figures, often to save the woman's offspring from being destroyed. This is godly deception, and it is a weapon that is used by women all throughout the Bible. If you don't believe me, you look at Sarah, who deceived Pharaoh and Abimelech. You look at Rebekah, who deceived Abimelech. You can look at Rachel, who deceives Laban. You look at the Hebrew midwives, who deceive Pharaoh. You look at Rahab, who deceives the men of Jericho. You look at Michael, who deceives Saul. You can look at Esther, who deceives Haman. The list goes on and on and on, right? God uses women in a godly deception, using the enemy's weapon on him in order to save her offspring. So here, Jael is following in the faithful footsteps of many who came before her, outwitting and deceiving the serpent figure, Sisera. She says, come inside. Everything will be all right. Come on in. You're tired. You know, we've got a peace treaty here. Everything's good. Don't be afraid. She covers him with a blanket or a rug. She gives him a false sense of security. Everything's okay. He asks for water, but instead of giving him water, she gives him milk. Milk is used in the evening to help people go to sleep. In the song, in chapter 5, it says that she brought him milk and cheese curds. Right here, take this. This will feel so good in your tummy, sister. You're going to be just fine. You just lay down and take a nap. This is what she's doing, making him feel nice and safe and comfortable. He thinks that she's keeping guard over the tent as he takes a nap, for he's really tired. Yet, what Sisera does not know is that Jael is faithful to Yahweh, no matter what. No matter what her husband does, her allegiance first and foremost is to God himself. And this daughter of Eve is about to crush the head of the offspring of the serpent. So here lies Sisera, asleep in Jael's tent, completely unaware of what is about to happen. And then verse 21, we see, but Jael, the wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand, then went softly to him and drove the tent peg into his temple until it went down into the ground while he was laying fast asleep from weariness. So he died. This is what she did. This was all part of her plan. I'll bring you in, make you feel really nice and comfortable, lay you down. Once he's asleep, she gets the tent peg. Pretend this is a tent peg, all right? And sneaks over softly. And the story in chapter 5 says that he fell down between her feet. So she probably just stood over him like this and poof, and lights out for Sisera. The serpent's head has been crushed by the woman, thus fulfilling the prophecy that Deborah said to Barak. Do you remember when he was lacking faith, a weak faith? She says, this road will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will hand Sisera over to the hands of a woman. Jael is that woman. And Jael now images Christ by crushing the serpent's head, which is what Jesus did upon the cross. She images all of those faithful, godly women that came before her by deceiving the serpent, using the serpent's weapon against him in order to save the offspring of the woman. This is indeed a great, great act of faith. In fact, if this causes us to be a little uncomfortable, I don't know if I can celebrate this. There's all sorts of bad things in this. This is where we must, again, not be polarized by opinions, but just go to the scriptures. Because we see in the Song of Deborah, in chapter 5, verse 24, that Deborah sings about Jael. And she says, most blessed of women be Jael. Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, of tent-dwelling women, most blessed. See, God looks at Jael and says, you are the most blessed among women. In fact, there's only one other woman in the Bible that has that title. It's the mother of the ultimate snake crusher, which is Mary. When Mary goes and visits Elizabeth, and Elizabeth says, oh, most blessed among women are you. Jael is imaging, typifying, pointing toward Mary, pointing toward Christ, pointing toward redemption, and her crushing the head of the serpent figure, Barak. So here, we see God's faithfulness to his promise back in Genesis 3:15, that the offspring of the woman, indeed, though hostile engagements, would crush the head of the serpent. And each of these victories, again, points to the ultimate snake crusher, which is Jesus. Deborah was a judges who raised up a generation that trusted in the Lord. And by doing so, she empowered men like Barak to do what God has called them to do. This is what her role was as a mother in Israel. I'm going to empower these men to go and fight. I'm going to empower these men to lead, to be the men God has called them to lead. Church, we need Deborah and Jael to be seen not as villains or people we should ignore or just skim over because it's a little hard to digest. We need women like Deborah and Jael in the church. We need women that are strong in their faith before God. We need strong women who are able to listen to God, able to follow his lead and lead in the way that he has called you to lead, has designed you to lead. We need strong women who are not afraid to speak the truth, who are not ashamed to follow God no matter what the cost. We need women who will raise up godly generations so that we might see the gospel go forth. We need strong women who will empower men to fight as God has called them to fight. We need strong women to empower men to lead as God has called them to lead. We need strong women who image God's maternal care for his people as only women can. This is what the church needs. The church has not done a good job historically trying to understand how do men and women function within the church together. The pendulum swings from one side to the other, and oftentimes we want to dismiss texts like this, or we want to make something about a text that's not there. As Exodus Church, we want to be devoted to the text and say, okay, we need women like Deborah and Jael. And sisters, this is what God is calling you to. This is what he's leading you toward. You are to look to Deborah, look to Jael, look at their faith, look at their devotion to God. You need to be brave and see yourselves as mothers amongst the people of God, raising up another generation. Look to Deborah, look to Jael. Don't be afraid to crush some serpents' heads when they come into your tent. And you do that by raising up men and women that continue to advance the gospel by the power of the Spirit. Let's pray.